All right, so with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tony Wells. Dr. Wells has a very unique perspective that he will share with us today in discussing his book, A Tale of Two Navies, 1960 to 2015 and the Way Ahead. Dr. Wells is the only living person to have worked for British intelligence, served in the Royal Navy on numerous ships, and on exchange with the U.S. Navy. It was USS Bainbridge as a British citizen. As a civilian, he worked with the U.S. Navy from 1983 to 2015 in various capacities, including at sea in USS Coronado and USS Florida, as well as several agencies of U.S. intelligence during that same time. Currently, Dr. Wells is a visiting senior research fellow at the Center for Intelligence and Cybersecurity at King's College in London, and he currently lives in the Plains, Virginia. I had to Google that, and it's a population of 217 as of the last census. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Tony Wells.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Well, thank you, Katie. And Bill, where is Bill? He's disappeared. Oh, there he is. He's operating the machine. Well, first of all, thanks to Bill, who I met some time ago, and to Katie for organizing this and inviting me to come and speak. And there's some connection as well with Captain Stretch Phillips over here, retired, who's a long-term friend of mine as well, and obviously a distinguished former. Well, no one's ever former in the Surface Warfare Committee. I've got about, Bill tells me, about 20-25 minutes to chat this morning. So, 65 years is a long period to sort of canter through in any kind of detail, which I clearly can't do. So I'm going to be very picky about what I'm going to talk about, pick some themes out which I think are relevant for today, and show why the past is important for today and where we're heading in the future, and a particular relevance for the serving officers here in the room today, where I think, and I'm not saying this just frankly because I'm here with the Surface Warfare Committee, I genuinely believe that your moment in time is coming yet again, along with our submarine friends and that community I've been well associated with for decades, and also with the Surface Warfare Committee, because, by the way, as you all know, British naval officers are all surface warfare officers. Everyone. Doesn't matter whether you're a submariner or an aviator or whatever. Everyone's trained as a surface warfare officer, and everyone reverts back to becoming a surface warfare officer. The admiral that led the Falklands campaign, was a submariner, but after his command as a commander, he went back to the Surface Navy. So, I have a serious surface warfare view of the world from my British days, as well as obviously serving, with the United States Navy. I want to start off by showing one important, hang on, got the wrong one. There we go. Oops, no. Come on. There we go. Here's a photograph which I think should always stick in your memories. Notice the date, August the 10th, 1941, Placentia Bay, just off of Newfoundland. And this is HMS Prince of Wales, and I think you can probably see the two most important gents there, right there, okay? Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. And so this is just a few months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so they've come there covertly. Winston Churchill came out on board Prince of Wales, which, as you know, was later sunk off Malaya with a renown. After the Japanese attack upon Pearl Harbor, unfortunately. And so this gathering was very, very important because Britain was obviously at war with the Nazis. The United States wasn't. Franklin Roosevelt was in the midst of changing, if you like, the American public view of the threat in Europe before the attack on Pearl Harbor. This gathering is important because they actually planned the grand strategy for the war on board this ship. And what they did was to essentially have a maritime strategy and a maritime expeditionary warfare strategy, which was basically, we'll invade North Africa, into Italy, through the tail of Italy, through Sicily, and then the grand invasion of Europe, which eventually came, obviously, on June the 6th, 1944. So they had this grand strategy in their minds, these two leaders, and the navies were central to that. It was all about naval strategy. Remember, Winston Churchill had been First Lord of the Admiralty twice. just before he became Prime Minister, he was First Lord of the Admiralty when the King asked him to become Prime Minister. And Franklin Roosevelt obviously had a strong Navy background. He'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy years before. So they had this Navy view of the world. And I think that's important because the political leaderships have to have that view in order to recognize the importance of maritime grand strategy and particularly expeditionary warfare. Now that wasn't all that went on, and people talk about the special relationship, and some people have said in the media recently, oh, it's sort of being threatened by stuff that's currently going on, which I won't bother us with. But essentially something else happened here below decks. A very crucial thing happened between these two gentlemen, and they had this secret handshake. And that secret handshake was a special relationship, and that special relationship was really very simple. It was called the exchange of all the stuff and data, highly classified, that was going on at Bletchley Park, okay, and the Enigma data with the American Magics data. And that's what occurred, and that's what the special relationship was about, and what it's always been about. It's called the exchange of intelligence. And it's not about, a common language, and cultural exchanges and Rhodes scholarships and all that stuff. That's all important, obviously, but really it's been about the continuing relationship between the American and British intelligence communities. And I'm going to explain as my talk goes on why the Navy side of things was actually the centerpiece of this, because Bletchley Park was basically run by the Royal Navy. All those key civilians there, you've all read about Alan Turing, who invented the first computer and cracked the Enigma code using it, or didn't crack it, but actually applied it so that they could, on a daily basis, understand what the Nazis were all about. Well, that exchange and that agreement, my old tutor back in the 60s, a gentleman called Harry Hinsley, became Sir Harry Hinsley, worked on all that stuff and actually brought the first machine in an airplane, an Enigma machine from Bletchley Park to Washington, D.C. to give to the United States Navy so they could have their own machine here in Washington. So that was the beginning of what has gone on ever since and still goes on today. So the special relationship between the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy in intelligence matters has endured more than any other part of Anglo-American relations. If you look at all the diplomacy, they had a few fallings out over, Suez was a little blip on the radar, a little blip over Vietnam. The British didn't participate, the Australians did, blah, blah, blah. But leaving all that sort of stuff aside, the intelligence communities of both nations have worked hand in hand, but particularly, and I emphasize this, the navies have been the true golden thread running through that relationship ever since World War II, and particularly since the 1960s. And I'll explain why the 1960s are important in a moment. So bear that all in mind, because our two navies are the heart and soul of the special relationship in terms of special collection, operations, sharing information, and doing what they do. And I think that's been the single big theme that runs through this book and explains how we managed to deal with the Soviet threat, how we're still working together, and all of that. Oops, sorry about that. I've got this upside down. Let's talk about this. This is the last British fixed-wing carrier, HMS Ark Royal, was decommissioned in 1979. Some very bad things happened, in my opinion, to the Royal Navy in the 1960s, actually from between 1964 and 1970. As you know, in this country, in 1947, we had the big changes occurred with the Defense Acts, which created the Air Force, the Central Intelligence Agency, created the Joint Chiefs Organization, and brought together the whole thing that you are familiar with today in terms of defense structure. The British were a bit later on than that. In 1964, the then Secretary of Defense, and I was a very junior officer, like, yay big, for 7 years, a gentleman called Dennis Healy. And Dennis Healy had a different view of the world from the Admiralty. Okay, very, very, very different view of the world. And he decided that aircraft carriers were not what the British needed. They were withdrawing east of Suez, decolonizing and all those things, and he had this vision that the Navy didn't really matter anymore and was just going to be an echelon, maybe of the US Navy in the Northeast Atlantic, protecting the SLOCs against the Soviet Union. My old boss at Greenwich, I taught at Greenwich as a junior lieutenant commander in the early 70s. My old boss, Brian Ramph, who was the top professor, was at Balliol College, Oxford, with Dennis Healy. Well, Dennis Healy was a member of the Communist Party, but my old boss was at Oxford with him, okay? He was absolutely no kidding communist. So this guy in 1964 becomes Secretary of Defense in Britain, right? So he had a different view of the Navy. My old boss is sending him papers when I was a professor at Greenwich, telling him that he screwed up the whole British defense posture because the two didn't have a very good relationship as a result. But Healy eventually said, these things are going to go. We're going to take away what you would call the surface strike power and basically become a Northeast Atlantic Navy. And as a result, all the bases around the world disappeared. I mean, crucial bases, with one or two exceptions. Fortunately, Diego Garcia was kept on, which has become very crucial for American operations, and one or two other places like Missouri. But a lot of places, really crucial places, went, which was hugely erroneous. Well, part of that change included creating the Central Defense Staff in London, and they got rid of the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, which Winston Churchill had, remember? That job went. That was a cabinet position. Very senior cabinet member was the First Lord of the Admiralty. So under the new Ministry of Defense hierarchy, the Navy staff got pushed down under a new Central Defense Staff, which could be run by the Air Force, the Army, whoever, and everything got multiplied in terms of staff, civil servants and all that. And I remember in the 60s all this happening and thinking, you know, this isn't good for the Navy. Well, it wasn't. And so the Navy had lost its political influence both in the cabinet and in the House of Commons because it no longer had political representation. Unlike the United States Navy, where I think you've been very fortunate, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, sorry, in having maintained the role of having that connectivity legally and constitutionally with both the House and the Senate, and maintaining that two-way influence and dialogue between your politicians, our politicians, and the Navy staff. The British lost all that capability. In fact, they were pushed down. And I remember several First Sea Lords, when I kind of moved up the chain myself, were basically at war within the central staff over Navy policy because it was essentially being eroded. Well, as you know, the pendulum has swung the other way. And guess what? You know, the two new carriers have just been launched. And guess what? The HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales. So it's taken a long time for people to recognize the value of maritime strategy. There was a huge gap. You see in the book, you know, I actually annotate, you know, who in the American political system has a Navy background. I mean, in terms of presidents and senators, members of the House, blah, 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 versus the British. Only one British Prime Minister since 1945 has had any kind of Navy experience, James Callaghan. And he was a very junior enlisted guy during World War II. God bless him, I'm not demeaning that, obviously. But, you know, it tells you that they didn't have what I would call the same political perspective on the role of the navies during this period. Well, despite all of that, if you like, bad news, and it kind of was bad news because I kind of lived through it as a junior officer, seeing the erosion of the role of maritime power and its significance strategically, because there were groups like my old bosses at Greenwich who wanted the British to maintain the overseas forward presence because they could see what was happening with the Soviet Navy, because the Soviet Navy was actually gearing up, if you remember, in the 60s and then into the 70s. They were saying, no, we got it wrong. We don't want to be putting this huge army into Europe at massive cost, and the RAF Germany and all the, gosh, we should be putting it into where we have a real contribution, which is in maritime power. So that was a very significant, you know, change in the strategic, you know, situation. The intelligence cooperation and the operational connectivity with the US Navy, and this is really important, never dwindled. So despite the changes, the British Navy staff and the naval intelligence community, and then their echelons in GCHQ Cheltenham, where there's massive Navy presence at the equivalent of NSA, which is just outside of Cheltenham, England, and at MI5 and MI6, they stayed absolutely locked together, and then with their American counterparts. And so all of the stuff that happened during the Cold War in terms of sharing and monitoring and tracking the Soviet Union's assets continued, and very successfully, hugely. I mean, I was involved in, I ran special programs for 5 years, and so I kind of know what we did together. And so none of that was affected politically by the likes of what Dennis Healey did with his changes during his 7-year tenure as Secretary of Defense in Britain. We continued to work together, the two navies, and lived through it, through all sorts of strong bonding, both at sea and operations, all the stuff that a lot of you, I'm sure, who are old enough got up to during the Cold War. And 1962, Prime Minister Harold Wilson and President Kennedy met in Bermuda and had a handshake, another handshake, and basically they agreed to exchange, the Americans agreed to exchange all our nuclear technology and secrets with the British. And so the British were able to build their Polaris submarines and attack submarines. And from then on, there was total connectivity between the submarine forces, just as there are today, in terms of operations, intelligence collection, and blah, blah, blah. So that was a very, very significant agreement. And following that, there were other technological exchanges. Captain Phillips over here and I were involved in all sorts of things to do with the Tomahawk program. We gave the British the Tomahawk. We set up the CMSA at Northwood, England, so we could exchange data with the British for Tomahawk when it became operational, and a whole bunch of other things. The British, on the other hand, they did give us the angle flight deck, okay? It's a British thing, right? And a bunch of other things too. In fact, this book of mine got reviewed in the Washington Post by a guy called Tom Schaff, who was in the same graduating class of Annapolis Admiral Trost. So that's what, like 1951. Well, Tom Schaff reviewed this book of mine, and this is, I'm not on an ego trip here. He ends up, after the end of this review, with a very nice piece. He says, I really owe the British everything. I wouldn't be writing this article today, because he was a naval aviator, and this guy ejected twice. And both airplanes had the Martin Baker ejector seat, which was British, right? So, I thought it was a very nice thing, the fact that here was the British, the British got American nuclear technology, and the aviators got the Martin Baker ejector seat. I thought it was that was a nice thing that Tom Schaff came up with in his little review of my book. So I thought it was kind of fun. But he was serious. He said, "Look, I wouldn't be here. I'd be dead." He evidently lost engines twice and had to eject. The British cooperated operationally, technologically, right the way through the period, just as they are today. I mean, the British are getting the F-35 on the two new carriers, exchanging pilots. The British are training down at Pensacola as I speak, and also with the Marine Corps. They're going to be Marine Corps pilots flying with a combination of RAF pilots who are going to fly on the carriers, as well as British Navy pilots. So it's going to be quite an interesting collection of aviators working together. When the Soviets went under the ice, as you know, they figured out that we knew how to track them and locate them and do bad things to them. They realized that they had to go somewhere to hide to fire the strategic missiles. And they went under the Arctic ice, as you know, and they would find Polinias and fire missiles, and we tracked all the stuff they were sending over to places in Kamchatka and other places in Soviet Asia. The British came together with the US Navy, the submarine forces. British hardened their submarines, we hardened ours. I've got one photo that I don't know why they didn't put it in, but there's one where you've got a British SSN and an American SSN surfaced together at the North Pole. So there's complete joint operations on the submarine sides, and this is a good photo because it shows you just how good we are at doing these things. Let's get to an operational thing. 1967 June War was a pretty nasty time for a lot of things in the Middle East, as you know. The Russians were supporting Syria and Egypt. Jordan unfortunately joined them. I don't know why King Abdullah, King Hussein did that. It was a very bad decision in my opinion, but Jordan joined the other Arab countries against Israel, and you probably know the story. I'm a little honored. It's probably the highest honor I've ever been accorded, quite honestly. It's by sheer, I don't know, set of circumstances, but I am the third chairman of the board of the USS Liberty Alliance. Admiral Moore was the first chairman, and a very distinguished naval aviator was the second chairman. By default, because everyone's died, I'm the third chairman. I'm not exaggerating. There's a few of us left, by the way. But Admiral Moore was very intense and very incensed about the way the Liberty crew were treated after the attack on the USS Liberty. And for various reasons I won't bore you with, I was an expert on what happened during that war because I was here working for the US Navy and the intel community in the 70s when I was still in uniform with the British, and for some reason they said, we want you to be the guy looking at the Liberty thing. This is when we were really examining what the Soviet Union was up to. This is like 1976, 77, that kind of time period. I was involved in a thing called Sea War 85, which was planning a war against the Soviet Union in 1985. A guy called Captain John Underwood and he was an aviator, and I put together a master plan for Admiral Trost for all of that stuff. Well, I got detailed to sort of be the investigator in chief of all of this stuff. So I got all the intel from everywhere. I was clear to, ridiculous. I got all the British stuff too. And so Admiral Moore later on said, I want you to come and join this board. This is after he'd retired. And I want you to come and be our, guru on various things. So I was honored to so now I'm the chairman of the board because all my illustrious predecessors, they've all passed away. I've been to, I don't know how many funerals at Arlington for the board of the USS Liberty Alliance. Some great people, wonderful people. Anyway, so I kind of know more about what happened than during that attack. The interesting thing was, coming back to the British and the US Navy cooperated to decide how we're going to deal with the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was supporting Syria, and when things got out of hand, when Moshe Dayan decided that he was going to march into Syria, not just take the Golan Heights, this is part of the Liberty scenario if you read my book, this was a moment in time when things went really very badly south, probably worse in my opinion than the Cuban Missile Crisis in terms of the threat. The US Navy and the British Navy really got together to decide how they're going to handle the Soviet Navy, because the 5th Escadra expanded its number of units coming out of the Black Sea and those coming from the Northern Fleet all the way around into the Mediterranean. Suddenly, this is the biggest deployment ever of the Soviet Navy. And so the British and the Americans got together and we decided, how we're going to handle all this, who's going to track who's going to monitor who. HMS Victorious, which is one of the carriers that, Healy got rid of, was in Malta. It's detained there with a lot of the US and British submarines who were doing all the usual tracking and tailing operations. But that was a very important time. I interviewed Secretary of State Dean Rusk 3 times in the sort of 76, 77 time frame. He told me very bluntly, I always remember, he said, this is the worst moment of my life, because when they attacked when the Israelis attacked the Golan Heights, and we figured out through intel that Moshe Dayan wanted to march into Syria and actually take Damascus. He said, President Johnson and I just were we got on the hotline and said, look, we got to stop this nonsense, because the Russians were threatening to bring in forces into Syria to counter the Israeli invasion. Fortunately, they stopped on the Golan Heights, and the rest is history. But it's interesting that naval power, naval diplomacy was used to counter the Soviet Union extremely successfully. And then, of course, they did get access to Alexandria. The Russians did because of their relationship with Egypt. But all that subsequently went south. Over time, that relationship failed. But the British Navy and the U.S. Navy stood firmly together in all of those good things. During the Cold War, of course, the monitoring and collection operations persisted against platforms like this. This is the Oscar. You probably remember that when it was launched in 1980. I don't know if it was anyone I don't know when you joined the Navy, but okay. I was sitting in my office in London when the pouch came in with all the satellite overhead pictures from the United States. This had just popped out of the building hall up in the north, along with one or two other things, and someone came rushing and said, "Boss, you got to look at it." And I said, "Oh my God, okay." So this came out with Typhoon. Remember, they both came out in 1980, Typhoon and this. So we suddenly are faced with a change in capabilities, right? In terms of noise levels, missile capabilities, a lot of stuff. And we had all been working very hard to figure out, what the next generation capabilities were to get ahead of that and all of that. So I spent a good part of my life in that business, working hand in glove with some great Americans. You probably remember people like Rich Haver, people in this room, people like that, just incredible people. All sorts of intel ops we pulled off, which, some of it's still not known about, thank God. But it was a great time. But this was a capability that we were really seriously worried about. And at the same time, 1982, the Falklands were invaded, and I was heavily involved in that whole war. The United States, as you know, stood absolutely firm with the United Kingdom politically and diplomatically, but more importantly, it was a Navy war, and it showed several things in my opinion. One is expeditionary warfare, naval power was the only way to deal with that problem. But it also showed a failure as well, didn't it? It showed the fact that the British Foreign Office, it was a Foreign Office thing, not a Minister of Defense thing, because I lived through all this, they would not maintain what I call persistent presence in the South Atlantic to deter the Argentinians. We took away our submarine presence down there. We had a ice patrol ship Endurance down there, and the captain, I remember, was sending us messages saying, look, these people are going to invade. You got all this intel around Gripviken and some of the islands. They're saying, look, they're getting ready to take over. And the Foreign Office ignored it. I remember going over to the Foreign Office and saying, don't you understand? They're going to do it this time. And they were saying, no. And Lord Carrington, the Foreign Secretary, was on an overseas trip. And I went over there on the day they invaded. I said, where's Lord Carrington? He said, well, he's not here. Well, I'm not kidding you. 3 days later, Prime Minister Thatcher asked for his resignation. And the reason was simple. They had just not read the tea leaves. They'd not let the Navy be forward deployed in a deterrent posture to prevent that invasion. The United States then stood by the British. President Reagan was incredible. And without the increased number of Sidewinder missiles, this is really important, the British didn't have enough Sidewinders for the Sea Harrier on the two carriers they sent south, Hermes and Invincible. They didn't have enough weapons. Suddenly they appeared. And so, they shot down nearly 100 Argentinian aircraft total. And without those American missiles, that wouldn't have happened. And without a lot of American support I still can't talk about, particularly on the intel side, it really helped because the British remember, they didn't have any long-range aerial reconnaissance. So they didn't have the ability to provide tactical air intelligence the way in which we did with our carriers. Because remember, they didn't have any carriers. They had the Invincible class, those 20,000-ton through-deck cruisers they were called, which was the British Navy staff's answer to the carriers having been got rid of. It was a very clever trick. we played on the politicians. We called them through-deck cruisers, but they really flew the Sea Harrier, if you remember. That was there's a game we had to play in order to provide the Navy with some form of air power at sea. So without those Sea Harriers, that operation would never have occurred. A very good contemporary of mine unfortunately had the duty of having to sink the Belgrano, direct order from Margaret Thatcher, the first Sea Lord, Chief of the Defence Staff, went to her and said, "This is what's going on, Prime Minister." She said, "Sink it." And so she gave the order, and boom, the Conqueror did sink the Belgrano. And of course the Argentinian Navy went home and never reappeared again during the whole of that campaign, which shows the power of a nuclear attack submarine. But also, coming back to the surface Navy, without the surface Navy, there would have been no recapturing of the Falklands Islands. I mean, it wouldn't have happened. Without the surface Navy ability to defend the 3rd Commando Brigade, provide all the missile support, ASW support against the 2 Argentinian submarines that were lurking around, it wouldn't have happened. And I think that's the theme I'm going to finish on in a minute, try to jump forward a bit, is that clearly forward deployed cooperative presence between the 2 navies is unbelievably important. Here's Conqueror, by the way, coming back to Faz Lane, the submarine base in Scotland. You know, it's flying the Jolly Roger, which means it, you know, scored a hit during the war. The British, in their strategic reviews, really got things wrong for quite a while, even after the Falklands. I remember the Secretary of Defense, John Nott, who basically was forced to resign. It's in my book, you know, the sort of famous interview he had with Robin Day, the British BBC interviewer, when he called him a here today and gone tomorrow politician. And he got up and walked out in front of like 10 million TV viewers in Britain. And then he resigned. Well, he still continued the downward trend during the 80s of the Royal Navy. And it wasn't until they had a serious strategic review when they really looked, if I dare say, at what I call grand strategy. You know, what are our vital national interests? How do you implement them? That they realized that they'd just forgotten their own history. They'd forgotten their own history, that maritime power and forward presence and expeditionary warfare is the policy that Britain had pursued for the best part of 600 years. And they'd forgotten it. And now they'd invested money in all the wrong things, and now they need to get it back in order. And so they did. I can't remember the date of the review that essentially put the 2 carriers back and then increased the nuclear attack submarine program, the new surface warfare programs, and all of that. So that's all on the up. Stretch Phillips and I were involved in several sort of cooperative programs with the British. You know, one of the important things that we've done on the targeting side, and I'm going to pass this around because for some reason NMIC, you know, I gave a talk over at NMIC in Suitland, and they didn't, for some reason, didn't include this picture in this set. I think for sensitive reasons. It's not classified, but I think there's some people there they don't want. If you pass that around, it's on board the USS Florida. I'm on the photo there. There's Admiral Mark Kenny, if anyone remembers Mark Kenny, and Admiral Paul Lambert, Vice Admiral Paul Lambert from the UK, and we're just about to take them to sea in the Florida and show them some new stuff. And this is all about real-time targeting. It was all about, well, how do we put together joint operations where the British have Tomahawk, thanks to people like Captain Phillips, CMSA, but wait a minute, that's against a fixed target, right? Right? We know where it is, we know the coordinates, boom, we put the Tomahawk on it from British attack submarines. Well, during the post 9/11 period, the British and the American navies were joined again at the hip. Immediately after the attacks, you know, we went into Afghanistan to the cave areas with American Special Forces and British Special Forces. American Navy attacked, as you know, from, I can't remember the name of the carrier that turned around and went back and, yeah, great operation by the CEO in doing that without anyone actually telling him to turn around and go, right? And so, there was total cooperation from the word, from the word go there. But the British had not got the kind of architecture that I had worked on at the three-letter communities to provide integrated flow of real-time intelligence from multiple sources, particularly all our space assets. And then although we shared space intelligence with the British, we didn't share integrated targeting intelligence with the British. So one of the issues was, right, you've got the Tomahawk in all your SSNs, right? We want to put those on Al-Qaeda targets, but a lot of those targets aren't fixed. They're moving. Number two, some of these bad guys we're going to go after, they kind of move from where they are even when they're fixed, right? Just when you're about to try to do something to them. And I had the privilege of working with that whole group out of Fort Bragg, and the team in East Africa put together all various things, which are all Navy based at the end of the day, because it was the Navies that delivered the hardware against these extremely nasty people. Do you remember the embassy bombings? Yeah, I can tell you now, all the Al-Qaeda leaders that were involved in attacking the embassies in East Africa are no longer walking. We got them all, okay? And thanks to all the stuff that I'm talking about. So we had to share a lot of that stuff with the British, and wherever it is, that picture, you'll see the moment where we took Admiral Lambert from the UK, if you want to pass that around, that picture, took him to sea in the Florida to show him some stuff that we needed to improve on the British side in order to go beyond the capabilities of the CMSA capability at Northwood, England. So, that kind of cooperation, endures today in every shape and form between the two navies. I'm going to scoot ahead because I'm running out of time. I told that I only talked for 20 minutes, and this has already gone way beyond that. The replacement of the Vanguard and Ohio classes, as you know, is well underway, totally joint and cooperative between the two navies, similarly with the Astute class and the Virginia class SSNs. I want to talk now about the surface navy. I think what this book of mine shows is that grand strategy is really about maritime strategy as far as the vital national interests of the United States and the UK are concerned. I don't believe in any other strategy. I think that's what comes out of this, and it's based on forward, persistent presence, having that ability to influence in every shape and form you can, and then worst case have the means to deal kinetically with threats that go south, right? You have to take positive action. I absolutely believe that's the result of the analyses that are in this book. I can't go into the detail to explain, but I think if you read the book, you'll come to the same conclusion. And I think that strategy is something that the British Navy, you're seeing there how the first Sea Lord and the CNO, Admiral Green, the previous CNO, they came together. There are agreements in place now to make a lot of that happen. Well, let's just sort of say one thing then in conclusion is that that forward presence right now, if we take, let's take a crucial area, obviously the East Asia situation with the Sprattlers, the Parasols, the whole natural resource issues there, all the things that not just the North Korean scenario, which we're all familiar with, but just generally the ability to deter by forward presence, a growing Chinese Navy. I'm less worried about the Russian Navy, if you want to know the truth. I'll tell you why. I don't think they're all that competent. I don't think they're that competent, and I think they have all sorts of problems. They're still a problem, but they're not like the Chinese Navy. Chinese Navy are doing what Gorshkov tried to do, and they're doing it very successfully. So I think they're the real problem. That's in my book. I mean, yeah, we got to keep an eye on the Russians, but I'm more worried about Russian nuclear accidents and things like that than about them involved in invading the Balkan states. I think the Chinese are a different issue. And similarly with all the other things that are happening in a maritime environment, drug running, human trafficking, illicit arms movements, other terrorist activities that are happening to and from the sea. All those things are part and parcel of us being with a forward presence, but also cooperating, not just with the British, but with everyone else, that are our friends and allies, in a what I think is a new maritime strategy. Admiral Mullen talked about force multipliers. Remember when he was CNO and then became chairman? Because of cooperation between the navies and making that happen, so that we're not just stuck there on our own as the key navy. We've got to work with our allies, particularly obviously the Japanese, South Koreans, and frankly the Vietnamese. Why not? People at the State Department said, "Are you in favor of us having a base in Vietnam?" I said, "Hell yes, absolutely. Why not? Why not? They're our friends now. We're putting billions in there in terms of economic investment. Why not, show the Chinese?" Remember, the Chinese did invade Vietnam. They've only invaded anywhere twice since World War II, India and Vietnam. And guess what happened when they invaded Vietnam? Yeah, they got pushed back, right? They really seriously got pushed back. So don't mess with the Vietnamese, okay? So they're going to be our friends and allies. So what I'm trying to say is, I think the British, and by the way, the British Foreign Secretary, a visit to Australia, made a speech in which he said, we will be bringing the British aircraft carriers to East Asia as part of that concept that I'm talking about for forward presence and deployment. I think one thing I'd like to see the United States do, and I'm not sure why we haven't done, is join the International Convention on the Law of the Sea. I still don't know why we're not members. I can't figure it out. I mean, I don't know what the issues are. I can't find out. No one will tell me. I mean, I talked to all my political friends who said, well, we haven't done it. I said, well, we should do, because if you read that convention, it is the legal basis for, if you like, operations at sea. And it also means, these are various red flags for the Chinese. Remember, the International Court at The Hague has already decreed legally against the Chinese for various seizures in the South China Sea. They said, no, you don't have any historic grounds for taking over some of these atolls and islands, okay? But who's going to enforce that? Right? There's a court in The Hague, but who's the policeman that says, okay, we're going to bring you to order? So I think the notion of enforcing the law of the sea is very much a surface warfare domain in terms of cooperation with these other international allies of ours, and particularly the British, who are going to go back to East Asia. They've committed to do that in terms of a battle group that can cooperate with the US 7th Fleet. So I think all of that is to be played for, but I really believe that the surface navy is the future in terms of all those overt things that are now so important, in terms of the Chinese threat, but in terms of gun running, drug running, and all of that, human trafficking, illicit weapons movements, and blockade. I mean, why aren't we blockading North Korea? I mean, seriously, publicly blockading North Korea. Historically, the British have used blockade for centuries effectively. And it's an international thing, because if the United Nations conventions have already decreed against North Korea, right, it's in the record. And the law of the sea says, yeah, if you're doing illicit things, then we in international waters have the right to exercise the rights of blockade, right? So, I mean, that's just me saying this. I'm just Tony Wells saying this. I'm not, whatever. And so, but I see that as a way of maritime power being exercised with our allies. We're not bullies. We're not out there poking people in the eye. But what we are saying is, if you're bringing illicit materials into this country that are decreed illegal by the United Nations, by mandate, then we have a legal right to enforce those mandates through the law of the sea. Back when I was at Greenwich in the early 70s teaching, we had a conference, the first ever conference on the law of the sea, and there was an Australian who'd become the professor of public international law at Oxford. He was just an incredible guy. And I remember, because I was this junior lieutenant commander, the admiral told me I'd got to do all the logistics, so I got to know this guy. And his book was called The Influence of Law on Sea Power. And I got to tell you this, I'm trying to get the date of the publication. Yeah, it was 1982. And it's by a guy called D.P. O'Connell. Unfortunately, he had cancer at Oxford and died too young. But if you want to read that book by Professor O'Connell, it's still, in my opinion, the best book on how, if you like, international law and maritime operations are intertwined. And that conference is great because as a result of that, there was a lot of people that came to it. A lot of influence was exerted, and eventually, we did get the Law of the Sea approved by the United Nations, the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So take a look at that book if you have, want to do a bit of reading. I'm going to finish with a quote from the book, okay? Because I haven't talked about 99% of what's in this book, but I'm going to just give you a quote, okay, to finish on. The substance of strategic, expeditionary naval diplomacy and warfare, its core characteristic values, is its ability to signal, to influence, deter, and at worst case provide the full range of measured force to meet all known and projected military, political, economic contingencies in support of US, UK vital national interests. This is the key lesson of naval history and grand strategy. I think that's what you guys are all about. I really do. Thank you.
Dr. Wells, I know I speak for the chapter when I say thank you for your service to 2 countries and for taking some time to share some insight here with us this afternoon. It was very valuable. Small token, sir, and we hope you will consider rejoining us again in the future.
Oh, well, I look forward to that very much. And
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure for me. Great pleasure.